General Hospital spoilers for Tuesday, June 17 reveal that Curtis had once believed that justice could be restored through truth and time, but after everything Drew had done, that belief had collapsed entirely. He was no longer the patient man standing on the sidelines offering counsel. He had endured too much, lost too much, and sacrificed more than enough to realize that silence no longer protected anyone. Drew had not only betrayed trust, he had manipulated the very system they all believed in, twisting outcomes, reshaping legal narratives, and disguising exploitation as benevolence. The worst part wasn't the lies Drew told, it was how precisely and deliberately he had used the people closest to him to secure power. And Michael, who thought he had control, who thought he could outmaneuver betrayal, was now left to confront the unbearable truth. He had been nothing more than a pawn in Drew's war for dominance. What Drew had done didn't just hurt Michael. It stripped away everything he thought was just. So when Curtis approached him with the proposition of destroying Drew from the inside out, no argument was needed. Their fury, their obsession, their hunger for retaliation, it was mutual. They didn't shake hands as friends. They aligned as co-conspirators bound by purpose, to dismantle Drew, expose the structure he had built on deceit, and ensure he never had the chance to rise again. Curtis brought connections, old contacts with deep access to systems and archives long buried. Michael brought influence, financial reach, and the Corinthos name that still held weight in the halls of Port Charles. Together, they moved quietly, efficiently, like shadows bleeding into the cracks of Drew's legacy. They uncovered evidence not only of fraud, but of criminal intent, documents tying Drew to tampered court orders, psychiatric reports manipulated for custody battles, secret deals masked as donations, and a pattern of coercion beneath every so-called act of protection. Michael had to reread the files multiple times to believe them. Every courtroom loss, every judgment that had tilted against him, every time Willow had chosen to believe in Drew, it had all been orchestrated. Curtis, watching him, saw the change. Michael was no longer just angry. He was transformed. When Curtis asked if he was ready to go all the way, Michael simply nodded. From that moment forward, everything accelerated. Curtis reached into darker corners of his past, trading secrets and calling in favors he'd sworn never to touch again. He used Portia's name to obtain sealed documents, leveraged buried files from WSB archives, and funneled information through encrypted channels. Michael, once the image of composure, began cutting ties. He stopped returning Carly's calls. He distanced himself from Willow, from Jason, from anyone who might ask the wrong question. His life became a war room, walls covered in legal maps, timelines, and surveillance photos. He didn't sleep. He didn't smile. And in his mind, there was only one outcome left, Drew's ruin. The final piece fell into place when Curtis traced an offshore account linked to Drew, an account used to funnel payments that coincided with judicial rulings in his favor. With undeniable proof of bribery, Michael and Curtis compiled a damning report and dropped it at Laura's door. There were no threats, no pleas, just a single message: investigate or we will. Laura, stunned by the depth of the corruption, launched a quiet but forceful inquiry. Within days, rumors spread across Port Charles. Drew sensed it too late. His confidence cracked. His grip on Willow faltered. Carly stopped defending him. Jason became distant. Sonny, though uninvolved directly, delivered one message that ended everything: Drew had broken the code. And that was unforgivable. The media broke the story in a storm, accusations of bribery, fraud, abuse of power. Drew was vilified. He was removed from boards, fired from contracts, and publicly humiliated. Willow packed her things and left. Carly refused to speak to him. Drew tried to fight back with lawsuits and smear campaigns, but the evidence was undeniable. And yet, as Drew fell, Curtis and Michael stood in the quiet knowing they had won, but something had changed. Victory didn't feel like justice. It felt like loss. Curtis looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man he no longer recognized. The choices he made, the lines he crossed, the parts of his soul he traded for revenge, they were irreversible. Michael sat alone holding Wiley and Amelia and felt nothing. No joy. No relief. Only emptiness. Their obsession had become identity. Their mission had become curse. What they had adjusted, what they had unleashed, was no longer about Drew. It was about what they had become to destroy him. And as the smoke cleared, the true cost emerged. Not Drew's fall, but their own. Lulu had returned to Port Charles not expecting parades, forgiveness, or even a warm welcome. Her return was quiet, almost ghost-like, slipping into a city that had continued to evolve without her. Lives had changed. People had changed. And Lulu, too, had changed, not just from the long recovery after her coma, but from the years of silence, reflection, and inner excavation that came with losing time, identity, and the trust of those she'd once loved deeply. She was not the same woman who had left the world in a haze of trauma. She was someone who now carried the burden of clarity, and with it, guilt. Guilt for what she had missed, guilt for who she had hurt, and guilt for the damage that silence and absence had created. But among all the wounds left unattended, one haunted her with particular intensity, her fractured relationship with Brooklyn. There was no simple name for what they had been to each other. Not quite friends, never true enemies. Rivals at times, allies at others. Their history was an unpredictable current, competitive, volatile, layered with childhood resentment and adult disappointments. Lulu had hurt Brooklyn before, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, but never with the kind of self-awareness she now possessed. And that awareness had become its own form of torment. She knew she had spoken out of jealousy, acted from insecurity, judged when she should have listened. She had drawn lines between them, sharp and unapologetic. That had lingered far longer than she ever meant. And while Brooklyn had always returned fire with fire, Lulu now recognized that behind every harsh exchange had been two women who never really knew how to coexist without armor. So it began not with confrontation but contemplation. Lulu didn't rush into the apology. She waited. Observed. Watched Brooklyn from a distance as she moved through the halls of General Hospital. As she navigated family dinners at the Quartermain mansion, as she laughed with Maxie or bickered with Chase. There was strength in Brooklyn now, a maturity that hadn't always been visible. She had grown in Lulu's absence, weathered storms of her own, made sacrifices that even Lulu didn't fully understand yet. And that realization only deepened Lulu's resolve. If she was going to rebuild anything, it had to begin with truth. Not grand gestures, not performative apologies, but raw, vulnerable honesty. When the moment came, it wasn't dramatic. No crowds. No tension-filled lead-in. Just two women standing across from each other in the park, the sounds of autumn rustling around them. Lulu had asked for 5 minutes. And Brooklyn had granted it with a guarded shrug. But what happened in those 5 minutes changed the course of everything. Lulu didn't start with excuses. She didn't recount every argument. Every failure. She simply told Brooklyn the truth, that during her years away, she had thought about her. Often. That her mind would loop back to moments that seemed small at the time but now felt heavy with regret. That she remembered the look on Brooklyn's face during their last argument before her collapse and how it had stayed with her like an echo. That she had judged her unfairly. Spoken without compassion, and failed to see Brooklyn not as a rival, but as a human being with her own dreams, fears, and pain. And Brooklyn, surprisingly, devastatingly, did not interrupt. She listened. Eyes sharp but unreadable, mouth set in that signature determined line that could break into a smirk or a sob without warning. And when Lulu finished, with the words, "I am sorry, not just for what I did, but for who I refused to be to you when it mattered," the air between them shifted. Something old died in that silence. And something fragile and new began to stir. Brooklyn didn't offer instant forgiveness. That wasn't who she was. But she offered something more valuable, acknowledgement. She said she heard Lulu. She said she didn't know what came next. She said it still hurt. But she stayed. She didn't walk away. She didn't lash out. She remained. And that was the first step towards something neither of them had expected, connection. In the days that followed, their interactions remained cautious but meaningful. A conversation outside Kelly's. A shared coffee in the hospital lobby. A moment of unexpected laughter during a chaotic Quartermain brunch. Bit by bit, the walls they had built began to crumble, not from confrontation, but from mutual effort. They didn't talk about the past unless it came up naturally, and when it did, they addressed it with honesty. Lulu didn't flinch when Brooke Lynn brought up her more judgmental years. Brooke Lynn didn't deflect when Lulu gently asked what it had felt like to carry so much resentment alone. They were rebuilding from ground zero, and this time, there was no script, no performance, just two women trying to rewrite a story that had always been defined by tension. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks. Moments where old habits resurfaced, when Lulu's need to fix things clashed with Brooke Lynn's independence, or when Brooke Lynn's sarcasm triggered Lulu's defensiveness. But now, they noticed. They named the patterns. And slowly, they changed them. Their dynamic transformed from reactive to responsive, from rivalry to recognition. They started to see each other not as reflections of their own failures but as women who had fought to survive in different ways. And through it all, Lulu realized something unexpected. That by making space for Brooke Lynn, she was also making space for herself. For growth. For forgiveness. For a version of her life that wasn't defined by her worst decisions. She stopped apologizing for breathing. She started showing up, not just to explain, but to participate. In community, in family, in friendship. And Brooke Lynn, too, softened in ways that surprised those around her. She became less guarded, more expressive. Her relationship with Chase deepened. Her role in the Quartermain household expanded. And she began speaking about Lulu not with hesitation, but with respect. Their story became one of quiet revolution. At family gatherings, they now sat near each other instead of opposite ends of the room. At work events, they backed each other up instead of competing. In moments of crisis, they called, they showed up, they supported. They weren't best friends. But they were something else, something stronger. They were women who had been through the fire and emerged not unscathed, but willing. Willing to try. Willing to grow. And as the months passed, their story began to inspire others. Maxie, once caught in the middle of their tension, commented on the difference. Chase noted the shift with quiet approval. Even Tracy, ever skeptical, observed that something about the two had changed for the better. Because it had. Not in a flashy, dramatic way. But in the way that mattered most, in consistency, in care. In the courage to admit when you were wrong and the grace to believe in someone's right to evolve. Lulu's apology had not just healed a broken bond. It had created a new one. And in that bond was proof that people could change, that history did not have to dictate future, and that forgiveness, when earned and offered without expectation, could be one of the most powerful forces in the world. Brooke Lynn and Lulu were no longer defined by who they had been. They were now shaped by who they were becoming. Together. Adjusted. Acknowledged. And, finally, seen. Sasha could feel her chest tighten the moment she walked into the hallway of General Hospital and caught sight of the chart Daisy had left behind at the nurse's station. It was meant to be a routine checkup, a follow-up to make sure the teen was adjusting after her last medication change. But what Sasha saw scribbled hastily in the notes made her stomach drop. Elevated vitals. Cardiac irregularities. An unconfirmed scan awaiting specialist review. The terms were vague, but to Sasha, they screamed danger. The world began to spin in a strange, surreal rhythm. And panic pulsed through her veins like a siren. Something wasn't right with Daisy. Something was very wrong. And Sasha, already stretched thin by her own emotional recovery, found herself tumbling back into that haunted state of helplessness, the kind she thought she had left behind. Everything in her life had been a delicate balancing act since the breakdown. Since the overdose. Since the spiral that had nearly swallowed her whole. But Daisy had become her anchor. Her purpose. A chance to give someone else what she had lacked: stability, belief, unconditional support. Now that anchor was threatening to crack beneath her, and Sasha could feel herself slipping into the terrifying space between past trauma and present dread. Her hands shook as she gripped the file tighter, as if by sheer force she could stop the future from crashing down. But it was already happening. Quietly. Relentlessly. Meanwhile, Willow, who had been trying desperately to rebuild some semblance of peace in her life after the devastating custody loss, was caught in a spiral of her own. Her mind had not been at rest in weeks. The courtroom humiliation still echoed in her psyche like a constant, punishing rhythm. But now, something new, something darker was taking hold. She had caught a glimpse of Sasha's reaction outside the exam room. The trembling hands. The pale skin. The haunted eyes. She had heard the whispers, caught the tension. Felt the shift in energy that no one had voiced aloud. Daisy's health wasn't just a minor concern. It was becoming a storm cloud. And for Willow, who had already watched too many people she loved slip away, whether by death, deception, or distance, this triggered something primal inside her. She began obsessing. She didn't mean to. But the more she tried to push away the anxiety, the more it tightened its grip. She started showing up at the hospital unannounced. Asking questions that weren't hers to ask. Sitting outside rooms where she had no reason to be. Watching Sasha with a fear that bordered on manic. It wasn't that she didn't trust Sasha, it was that she didn't trust fate. Not after what it had already taken from her. Not after what it had already made her endure. The situation with Daisy became the focal point of both women's unraveling. For Sasha, it was the echo of a past she had barely survived. For Willow, it was a manifestation of her fear that no matter how hard she tried to love, to fix, to hold on, everything would still fall apart. Their interactions became tense, laced with unspoken emotion. Sasha, fragile yet defensive, refused to let anyone question her ability to care for Daisy. Willow, frightened and guilt-ridden, could not stay away. And all the while, Daisy remained suspended in uncertainty. Test results were delayed. Diagnoses unclear. Every unanswered question became fuel for paranoia. Rumors spread like cracks in glass, quiet but destructive. Staff whispered. Eyes lingered too long on Sasha. Doctors tried to reassure, but their voices felt rehearsed. There was talk of second opinions, of transferring Daisy to a specialist. Each new update felt like a bomb to Sasha. And each silence, each pause, each vague nod from a physician sent Willow deeper into her spiral. It wasn't just about Daisy anymore. It was about control. About fragility. About the terrifying realization that sometimes love wasn't enough. Sasha had poured everything into being Daisy's rock, and now, as the foundation began to tremble, she could feel herself slipping again. Nightmares returned. Memories she had locked away began to resurface, the sight of her own cold hands in rehab, the echo of Liam's name in a hollow nursery. The sterile silence of a hospital room where grief had made a home. Willow, in parallel, began to feel her own identity fracture. She had failed as a mother, at least in the court's eyes. She had failed to protect Wiley. She had lost control of her own life. And now, watching Sasha teeter on the edge, she felt as if she were staring at a mirror reflecting her own undoing. Her attempts to help became invasive. She crossed boundaries without realizing it. Her words, meant to soothe, only widened the emotional gap between them. One morning, Sasha found Willow standing outside Daisy's room, tears in her eyes, hands clasped tightly in prayer. It was too much. Sasha broke. She screamed, words she didn't mean. Accusations fueled by exhaustion, desperation, and fear. Willow didn't respond. She simply collapsed into a chair and wept, the full weight of her own unraveling crashing over her. In that moment, two broken women finally faced not each other, but the trauma that had brought them here. That confrontation became a strange kind of release. The next day, Sasha approached Willow not with an apology, but with honesty. She admitted she was scared. She admitted she didn't know what to do if Daisy's condition worsened. Willow, in turn, admitted that she was terrified of watching someone else she cared about vanish into a darkness she couldn't stop. They didn't find a solution in that conversation. But they found something else, shared understanding. What they didn't know was that the test results were finally in. Daisy had a rare autoimmune condition, treatable but complex. It would require care, attention, monitoring. But it wasn't terminal. It wasn't irreversible. It wasn't the death sentence they had both feared. When the news came, Sasha wept not with relief, but with exhaustion. Willow held her. Neither said anything. They didn't need to. In the end, it wasn't about Daisy's diagnosis. It was about the emotional earthquake it had triggered. About the adjustments they had both been forced to make within themselves. Sasha realized she didn't have to carry everything alone. Willow realized she didn't have to control every outcome to be worthy of love. Their bond, once strained by trauma, began to stabilize. But beneath it all lingered something deeper, an understanding that the next storm could always be around the corner. That healing wasn't linear. That obsession, anxiety, and grief would come and go like tides. And that sometimes, survival meant simply standing still and letting someone else hold your weight for a while. They were learning. And in that learning, they found the only thing more powerful than fear. Connection. Joslyn walked into the room with her head high, the weight of her preparation tucked carefully behind her shoulders like armor. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, fine-tuned every slide of her presentation, memorized the flow of each supporting point. She was ready. She had clarity, data, conviction, and above all, a vision that she believed Vaughn would finally recognize as bold, transformative, and uniquely hers. Her confidence wasn't arrogance, it was earned through weeks of sleepless nights, self-doubt, revisions, and the quiet hope that she could finally step out from under everyone's shadow and carve out her place on her own terms. She had waited for this opportunity for too long. And now that she was here, seated across from Vaughn in the sharp, sterile silence of the boardroom, her focus narrowed like a laser. The room was sterile and glassy. Modern and impersonal, the kind of space built for confrontation dressed up as collaboration. Vaughn offered her a slight nod, the kind that could mean anything. Encouragement. Impatience. Curiosity. But she didn't let herself overanalyze it. She clicked the remote and began to speak. Her voice was strong. Her rhythm was precise. She explained market gaps, consumer behavior patterns, integrated social strategies, and brand psychology with a fluency that surprised even her. She saw the assistant taking notes, saw Vaughn lean forward slightly, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was working. That she was being heard. That this idea would finally be her breakthrough. That this room, this moment, would belong to her. And then Emma walked in. She didn't knock. She didn't apologize. She simply entered, quiet, seamless, composed in a way that felt both effortless and piercing. She didn't interrupt. She didn't say a word. But her presence shifted the gravity of the room instantly. Joslyn could feel it, the change in energy. The subtle but undeniable tilt of attention away from her and toward the woman who had just taken a seat at the far end of the table. Vaughn looked up. A flicker of recognition. A soft smile. And then a nod. Permission, unspoken but absolute. Joslyn continued speaking, but now her voice was chasing itself, losing momentum, turning the corner into hesitation. She tried to focus, to remain anchored in her slides, but every few seconds, her eyes darted to Emma, still silent, still poised, scanning the screen with clinical interest, as if diagnosing a patient's prognosis. And then, just as Joslyn reached the heart of her proposal, Emma spoke. It wasn't a contradiction. It was a question. Innocent on the surface. Polite even. But underneath, it carried weight. Emma asked why Joslyn had chosen a particular demographic target, suggested an alternate insight that reframed the problem entirely, and did so with surgical precision. Vaughn turned to Emma with curiosity. The assistant paused her note-taking. And suddenly, Joslyn was no longer in control of the conversation. What unfolded next wasn't an argument. It wasn't loud or combative. It was much worse. It was a quiet, methodical shift of narrative ownership. Emma didn't attack Joslyn's idea, she reconstructed it in real time, layering her insights, redirecting the premise, and introducing her own framework so subtly that by the time the meeting ended, no one was quite sure whose idea it was anymore. But Joslyn knew. She felt the sting beneath her skin. Her presentation, her weeks of labor, had been dissected and repackaged right in front of her. Vaughn nodded slowly, thanked them both, and said he'd think it over. But Joslyn could already see it in his eyes. The pitch no longer belonged to her. The future of the project, if it moved forward, would orbit around Emma. Not by force, not by command, but by gravity. And that realization struck Joslyn like a blow to the chest. Outside the boardroom, she smiled. She thanked Vaughn. She offered a stiff nod to Emma. But inside, something had begun to crack. She returned to her desk, opened her laptop, stared at the slides she had once been proud of, and deleted them all. What began that day wasn't a rivalry. It was an obsession. Joslyn couldn't stop thinking about the meeting. Not because she lost, but because she didn't even know how she lost. Emma had said so little, yet managed to dominate the space with terrifying ease. There were no raised voices. No dramatic takedowns. Just calm dissection. And that kind of control haunted Joslyn more than open warfare ever could. It meant that Emma didn't fight. She absorbed. She redirected. She owned. And now, Joslyn felt like a trespasser in her own ambitions. She began watching Emma. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. She observed how Emma walked. How she spoke in meetings, how she handled pressure, how she navigated conflict. Emma never tried to win the room. She simply assumed the room already belonged to her. Her quiet confidence. Her sharp intelligence, her ability to anticipate questions before they were asked, it all formed a psychological fortress that Joslyn couldn't breach. The more she watched, the more anxious she became. Not because Emma was cruel, but because Emma wasn't. There was nothing to blame. No fault to point to. Emma wasn't manipulative. She wasn't dishonest. She was just better. And that truth began to unravel Joslyn's sense of self. She started sleeping less. Eating less. Her work suffered. She tried to come up with a new pitch but couldn't focus. Every idea felt weak compared to the memory of Emma's voice slicing through the silence. She heard it in dreams. In elevators. In the quiet moments before her alarm went off. Vaughn, for his part, remained cordial but distant. There were no updates on the pitch. No feedback. Just a lingering silence that confirmed everything Joslyn feared: the meeting had chosen its winner. The obsession became paranoia. Joslyn began questioning whether Emma had planned it all. Whether she knew Joslyn was presenting that day. Whether she had studied the pitch in advance. But deep down, Joslyn knew none of that was true. The truth was simpler, and more devastating. Emma didn't need to sabotage her. She only needed to show up. That truth became unbearable. Joslyn began avoiding meetings where Emma might be present. She stopped contributing ideas in team settings. She avoided Vaughn entirely. And yet, the absence of interaction only magnified the obsession. Every silence felt like an indictment. Every compliment Emma received felt like a dagger. Every casual nod from Vaughn in Emma's direction felt like a verdict. What had begun as professional insecurity had now mutated into something psychological, something unnameable. It wasn't that Joslyn hated Emma. She feared her. Not because Emma had taken anything, but because she had revealed how fragile Joslyn's identity truly was. How easily it could be rewritten. How quickly a single moment could redraw the lines between success and irrelevance. Joslyn tried to recover. She sought advice from Maxie. She tried journaling. She tried therapy. But nothing touched the core of the ache. Because at the heart of it was a wound that no one else could see. A wound not made by betrayal, but by reflection. Emma had become a mirror. One that showed Joslyn all the places she had fallen short, and all the ways she might never measure up. And as weeks passed, something even more unsettling began to happen. Joslyn began to emulate Emma. She changed her wardrobe. Her posture. Her tone. She began pausing more before she spoke. Choosing her words with calculated softness. It wasn't imitation. It was survival. She thought that if she could absorb Emma's mannerisms, she might reclaim some of the ground she had lost. But all it did was hollow her further. The moment of collapse came silently. Vaughn announced in a staff-wide email that the initiative would move forward, under Emma's guidance. There was no mention of Joslyn. No acknowledgement of her role. No space for her in the rollout team. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the screen, feeling the world tilt sideways. And somewhere deep inside her, a new voice began to grow. Not a scream. Not a sob. But something colder. Something harder. Something determined not to lose again. Whatever came next, whatever Joslyn chose to become, it would be born from that moment. Not from defeat. But from transformation.